I'd like to get back to Alan's question because I'm not sure it was answered unless I missed something. I think what I thought he was asking is that there's a tax on land and there's a tax on the improvements. It seems like in the early history of America, as you said with William Penn, that they encouraged simply a tax on the land, not on the improvements.
Right.
And I thought Alan's question, and my question as well, is how over the course of time did they begin to include taxing improvements and then shifting the burden over time off of the land onto the improvements? Historically, say in America, over the course of, say, the last 2 centuries, was there something going on? Did it happen slowly? Was there...
It was the industrial era. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question fully, but because we got into the industrial era, a lot of people wanted to tax personal property. By that I mean machinery, locomotives, things like that. And to do that, you had to have a profession that could judge value. And there was no such thing as a profession that did that. There were very few professions before, say, 1870. But the mechanization of the Civil War caused professionalization to spread. This is almost my own pet theory, but a lot of writers have said the same thing. So you had a lot of competent people that could measure things after the Civil War, ex-officers. And a lot of them surprisingly got jobs doing things like judging value. And judging value in a place like Chicago was very important at the time because they had to build all this infrastructure. In Chicago, as you know, they actually lifted the whole city up, the whole downtown. Yeah, they had to lift it up to avoid the swamps in the Chicago River. So all of the Chicago that you walk on today has been lifted 3 feet into the air by a public civic project that was paid for by a charge on property owners. And so we have to get a good value, and so that's where it really started, where it became a serious issue to make sure you were accurate.
Well, when you say a professional, I assume you're, might be referring to land assessors,
yeah,
property assessors. But my question would be, because I understand you make this distinction between community created value and privately created value. And community created value would be the land, and the privately created would be the factories and everything else. Why would people say that they want a shift and start taxing privately created property? And why weren't they satisfied to say there's this natural fund of community created property that could cover community expenses? Why should we go after privately created property, knowing full well that anytime you put a tax on anything, you disincentivize that thing to exist? So if you're going to tax
you get less
privately created wealth, you're going to disincentivize creating privately wealth. So I don't understand historically when it happened and what logic it would be other than landowners saying, ha, we can get out of some of the tax by shifting it off of our land onto those other guys that are working, those working stiffs that are producing, value for the community. Let them pay my land tax.
Well, in Pittsburgh, remember, they went back, if you will, to the land tax because they were trying to break the hold of landowners in Pittsburgh, specifically the Shenley family. So why would people logically say that you have to go after personal or private property? There's a lot of wealth that was invested in that at the time, and it was fantastic wealth, the Gilded Age. So I think that people wanted money, not people, the government wanted money to create a city, worthy of themselves, Cleveland, places like that. They built a lot of infrastructure, and they couldn't get landowners to kick in. And nobody objected. I mean, if people had objected at the time, it might not have happened. But then you are able to regiment public thinking and public society in such a way that, of course, you wouldn't put a house up here if the government didn't help you. Now, of course, you should come back and say, you know, that's got nothing to do with it. You know, this is my money, this is my effort. But people didn't have the education. Henry George didn't publish until 1879, and by that time, this stuff was already ensconced and well on its way. It had been discussed by the physiocrats, but not in a popularized sense the way Henry George did. You know, that's why he was so dangerous. That's why they wrote him, you know, they wrote him out of history, and they came up with a school of economics to break the idea that land is special. Neoclassical economics, that came about at the same time as well.
So basically, if I could restate what you're saying in a clear way for me, as community progresses, improvements begin to grow, and then also the community is in need of revenue. So there's two alternatives at that sort of junction in time. You can say, well, the land values are increasing, so we simply have to collect more of the land value from the landlord, or the landlords, seeing what's coming, could say, well, let me throw a smokescreen. Let me say to the people, look, you've got all these fancy buildings now. You know, I've already paying a big chunk of money for. Why don't you go after those robber barons who are building all these fancy houses and so forth and so on? And the community, I mean, the community doesn't really decide. It winds up being in some council, and a few people sit together in an office and they make the decision, and it happens. Right?
There's a justification too. We shouldn't forget. I agree with you. Richard Ely, who was supposedly a Henry George acolyte and was a founder of neoclassical economics, he came up with the very dangerous phrase, scientific taxation. In other words, we all share these problems today. It's like in the state of New Jersey, you have to be a scientific barber. You have to get a state license. And everything is quantified, measured, and paid for to eliminate competition in the case of a barber license in New Jersey. But scientific taxation means we're foolish if we rely on the uncertain concept of economic rent. There are things that you can measure and that you can value, like a building or a machinery in a plant. And the term scientific taxation, I think, was used consciously to get people away from the idea of having everybody that owns what's under your feet pay the bill for the community. That's my view when I was reading Eli's essays. And he became pretty much a deadly enemy of land value taxation. So, okay.